So, ladies and gentlemen, I will start this last panel of the day, after already a very busy first day of this 10th Baku Forum. I won't introduce the panel now. I will do that person after person, but just mention that the gender imbalance with only one female colleague sitting at the, from your point of view, right-hand extreme side of the panel is not of my fault. So, but I think in terms of experience and quality, we of course have a very balanced panel. We heard earlier this afternoon that we are at least facing the three major challenges that we all know, is to say the climate emergency, the food insecurity with a rising number of people that are subject to starvation, and there is the nuclear insecurity. And so I think there's a little bit of consensus about these, at least these three pressing issues. I think there's also almost a consensus that the current system of multilateral cooperation at least has some weaknesses, not to say that it doesn't work actually and not efficient and effective, and that it is, moreover, not fit for purpose, that there are some fundamental changes to be brought to the multilateral cooperation. We will talk about that and try to explore in what direction the system should be fixed. I think starting from scratch is a little bit difficult, but how we could agree on fundamental changes that would make our multilateral system that was producing so much dividends to societies all over the globe since the Second World War, how that system could be re-engineered to a certain extent to meet its objectives. But before giving the floor as the first speaker to Hikmet Hajiev on the quite important role Azerbaijan is currently playing as leading the group of non-aligned states, I would like to ask the people, the production people, to launch the video that we will see before starting our conversation.
Sometimes the time has come to think about renovating your house. Obviously, the time has come to think about renovating the existing institutional structures. In the light we see, it's not just a question of faded colors. This panel calls for imaginative views on how the UN system's limitations can be overcome after 75 years of its existence. Welcome to the panel, Reinventing Multilateralism, a new era of non-alignment?
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Mr. Hikmet Hajiev, who's the head of the Ministry of Foreign Policy Affairs, head of the Department of Foreign Policy Affairs of the Presidential Administration of the Republic of Azerbaijan. I would like to invite you to be as brief as possible. But of course, in terms of the topic, I think we are all keen to listen to you. We heard this morning the President, and we had a meeting with the board also with the President yesterday. And this role of Azerbaijan at the helm in the chairmanship of the community of non-aligned states is quite key at this very moment. And so I invite you to comment maybe on what the President and what you are trying to achieve in terms of refurbishing the multilateral system from that position. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Yves, and I also welcome everybody, and also particularly welcome to our distinguished panel, and also privileged to speak on this panel about the concept of multilateralism and Azerbaijan's view. Multilateralism as such is one of the foreign policy priorities of Azerbaijan, and I'm also a great believer to multilateralism, not because when I started my career 23 years ago as the foreign minister of Azerbaijan in the multilateral department, but that time even while serving in our foreign ministry as a young diplomat back in 23 years ago, I have witnessed that how multilateralism, relatively being mid-sized or small-sized country for Azerbaijan, it gives them the same chance in the international fora to speak within the same voice, sometimes to agree or to disagree, and in a sense it provided Azerbaijan with a voice in the international arena. And the same applies to some other countries. Therefore, multilateralism When approaching to multilateralism, and we should understand the two fundamental issues. The first one, after the Second World War, codification of international relations. That's the emergence of further strengthening of international law. And second dimension is institutionalization of the international relations, but we have seen United Nations, specialized institutions, and further proliferation of some other institutions. Multilateralism is about fairness and justice in international system, and it's also about a dialogue and consultation, and it also, as I already said, provides a voice for every and each country. At the end of the day, regardless of the military economic power of the countries, every country has one single voice in the World Parliament, that is the United Nations General Assembly. And sometimes smaller nations and like-minded nations, regardless of their size, are coming together and raising fundamental international issues. For example, in the case of the climate change, we can, particular appreciation deserves least developed countries or island states, but as a result of their steadfast efforts, what we see the climate change issue has been so acute as international relations. It's just one single example, but we can continue the list. But currently, what we see is that multilateralism is at stake. Multilateralism has been challenged, and multilateralism sometimes proves itself not so very efficient. And I will now switch to the Azerbaijan's chairmanship of non-alignment movement, and we have also witnessed the same problems and same challenges. When Azerbaijan came to the helm of chairmanship of non-alignment movement in 2019, but we have also witnessed that this institution is fragmented, sometimes divided, and there was no single purpose within the institution. Therefore, we approached a little bit differently. First, try to return back to the fundamental principles of non-alignment movement, that is, the Bandung principles. Then to build commonality of interest. There are a lot of divergences. We cannot find a solution, we cannot find a consensus on all fundamental issues. At least there is a universal issues that we can build consensus around these fundamental issues. And based on this universality, as a chair country, that was in Azerbaijan, and we pursued first transparency, predictability, and honesty with regard to all of nations. And we assumed with responsibility that interests and also justice that Azerbaijan will protect as a non-aligned chair country. I believe that as a result of which we have seen overwhelming confidence and respect to Azerbaijan's chairmanship. And I can also provide you with a concrete examples how Azerbaijan provided for further development of multilateralism. Nevertheless, the concept is about all multilateralism, non-aligned movement within our chairmanship. COVID pandemic, and we have seen inefficiency and ineffectiveness and lack of reaction from the major international institutions. As Azerbaijan, as a chairing country, we didn't wait for the others to come, and we convened online summit meeting in the format of the contact group member states. And as a result of which, we developed our own solidarity, because non-aligned movement country, majority of them are least developed and developing countries, and they expected more from the international community, but there was no reaction. And we provided such a platform for our needs and requirements and our expectations. And then as a follow-up step, and we expected from the United Nations General Assembly and other UN institutions, but unfortunately, major stakeholders didn't provide that role, and non-aligned movement come up with such an initiative to calling for a special session of the United Nations General Assembly. And we succeeded to that. In a sense, we contribute to solidarity with regard to the COVID issue. And further on, and some other actions have been taken. And also vaccine nationalism, as my president today mentioned. And the context of the COVID, what we have seen, developed countries accumulated a huge amount of the vaccines, sometimes going 5 times bigger than their current needs. What about the else of the countries, about the remaining part of the world? And non-alignment movement come within a single solidarity position in the United Nations Human Rights Council and General Assembly about the equitable distribution of vaccines and putting aside vaccine nationalism. This couple of examples once again shows that when there is a commonality of interest, mutual understanding, and relatively smaller countries can also play a role and bring the voice of other countries at the international arena. And also, with regard to the current status of non-alignment movement, Azerbaijan's views that non-alignment movement needs a further revitalization, because what we see is East-West confrontation. Unfortunately, it's worse than it was the case during the Cold War time. Sometimes we're also getting such messages that, like a Stalinistic view that if you are not together with us, you are against us. That was original idea of the non-alignment movement. We are not against anyone. And we wish in a peace in East-West confrontation. Unfortunately, we don't know how it's going to end up. But non-aligned movement, returning back to its original philosophy of being aside of bloc policy, pursues its own agenda based on the Bandung principles, but also we cannot wait when this East-West confrontation will end. South-South cooperation should be alive, and developing countries. And because of the East-West confrontation and COVID, some of the acute problems didn't disappear. They continue to aggravate further. But how we'll handle all of this? And therefore, Azerbaijan continues with the non-alignment path and bringing together solidarity of the member nations, and also what we need within the non-alignment movement, further institutionalization. Because the current realities demand from us, and with the support of the member nations, we'll continue to that. In a nutshell, in a sum, Azerbaijan's multilateral policy or multilateralism from Azerbaijan perspective, first, is pursued at the regional level, and with the regional international organizations, we are active and will continue to do that. And secondly, within the non-alignment movement, and also within the non-alignment movement, we are calling yet for another action for the reform of the United Nations system, particularly the Security Council of the United Nations. It is completely undemocratic. It doesn't reflect and it doesn't represent the view of the international community. It's simply five policemen scenario, five policemen theory that has been established after the Second World War. One of the solutions, where is the voice of Africa? And the United Nations Security Council, unfortunately, no. Where is the voice of the non-aligned movement in the United Nations Security Council? Let's be quite frank. And Western Hemisphere, Western countries are represented with two countries, at least three countries, but over the remaining part of the world. Therefore, my president suggested, in the context of the reform of the United Nations Security Council, Africa should have a voice, and also non-aligned movement. On a rotating basis, chair of the non-aligned movement should also have its voice. It's not about Azerbaijan. We are ending our chairmanship. By the end of this year, we'll pass it to our friendly Uganda. But upcoming chair country can use this as an opportunity. Therefore, there is a comprehensive approach needs to be done. But multilateralism should be alive. There is no alternative to multilateralism, but international key players and big countries also they have own responsibility with regard to multilateralism and undermining multilateralism. Sorry for being long.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, including for a couple of concrete suggestions concerning the composition of the legitimacy of the system via the composition of the P5. I will come to Georgia and Bosnia-Herzegovina with two testimonials about multilateralism's strengths and weaknesses in the concrete cases of the history, recent history of these countries. But before giving the floor to the Georgian and Bosnia-Herzegovinian colleague, I would like to ask two people that have been in the General Assembly, in the chair, President of the General Assembly of the United Nations, have seen with a kind of helicopter view strengths and weaknesses of the system. Not so much, I would ask, an analysis of how bad things are, but as Hikmet has done, try to come up with some ideas about how to refurbish, how to strengthen, how to re-engineer the system in the light of the need for more efficiency and effectiveness. I start with Volkan Bozkir, who was the 75th president of the UNGA and also was Minister of European Affairs of Turkey. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I think today's world is facing a very different situation where we talk about uncertainty, unpredictability, and certainly a new era in the international fora is coming. But when we are trying to establish a new system, we are looking at the unsuccessful institutions like the United Nations or whatever it is. I personally think that the United Nations must be divided into two. There are very important activities that the UN is achieving, and many side institutions are doing great work in education, in health, in dealing with children, whatever, dealing with humanitarian aid, refugees. I mean, there are 20 side attached institutions which make the UN successful. Plus, I kept saying that you can go anywhere with a UN flag. It is respected, applauded anywhere you go. You can't go to the same places with a NATO flag or a US flag or whatever flag it is. So the UN has an advantage in that respect. But what is the problem is, on political issues, UN is not successful because the post-Second World War establishment, which created a system for the winners of the war, and the winners of the war are not as powerful as the losers of the war of today. So the many countries, realistically, who became powerful power points in the world, consider themselves to have a say in the Security Council system. But the problem is, how are we going to change the Security Council? Once upon a time in my country, in Turkey, we wanted to establish, to abolish the Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Court said, I will check into that. When you dissolve me as the Constitutional Court, I will make a decision. So it went nowhere. So if you want to get rid of the Security Council, one country will veto it. Or if that country doesn't veto, the other one will veto it. So we must look from that point. So what can we do? There's a big process going on. The countries are divided. Some countries want to become member right away, like Germany, Japan, Italy. They want to be countries in the Security Council having even a vetoing power. Some countries agree that, like my country, agree that it must be reformed, but it must be in a slower pace and not for the benefit of countries, but for the benefit of the United Nations system. African countries, they want to be a part of the Security Council, but they want 15 seats or 30 seats. Some countries say, well, they don't know what to do. So I defined it like a car. Some countries don't want the engine in a car. Some countries don't want the key of the car to work. Some countries don't want the car at all. So in these circumstances, I think the General Assembly, which I presided with honor and with pleasure, is the solution. Because it is the only democratic platform where every country in the world is represented, and every country has one vote. And there's no veto possibility. So I believe in political wins. I mentioned this in previous meetings as well. So if the General Assembly can create a political wind by its votes, by its messages, by its composure in the meetings, it will certainly affect the Security Council decisions. What we achieved during my presidency, which is now in reality that if a country vetoes now, it has to, if circumstances occur, it has to come to the General Assembly and explain why did that country vetoed. This is important because there is no result for that. But that country will understand that it's not my farm. I can do whatever I want because I won the Second World War. I have a veto power and I can do. So they will come, face the 193 nations, answer to the questions, and that freedom or that luxury they have will not be in their hands. And I think it will give some results. I have seen two or three cases where the Security Council was blocked. One was in the Palestine issue where there was difficulties going on, people were being killed, and there was not a possibility to establish ceasefire in the Security Council. So I called for a meeting of the General Assembly, and it was COVID time. It was the first time 14 ministers came to New York, attended physically the General Assembly meeting, gave their messages, and there was no resolution, and there was no result from the General Assembly. But even that meeting forced the Security Council to come out with a press release which caused the ceasefire. Concerning Myanmar, the Rohingya community, over 1 million, is now refugees in Bangladesh, and we couldn't achieve a result in the General Assembly and in the Security Council. Again, we did the same thing. So I think the solution is there, but meanwhile, we must also take advantage of the non-aligned movement type of formations. We grew up with North-South dialogue, G77, North-South dialogue, South-South dialogue. I mean, these were all helpful at that time. But there was Cold War, two polar formats. Now we are talking about North-North conflicts, and very different concepts came. But these institutions, these platforms, must be successful, as I mentioned in my beginning. Azerbaijan had a very successful non-aligned presidency. But I don't know if it could be followed the same way, with the same power. Azerbaijan took it as its own issue and brought the vision to a different stage. So if any institution is successful, people of the world, which is in very much lack of hope, will look to that to help the solution of problems. It would affect the United Nations as well.
Thank you very much. Yeah, please. We have another panel member with experience in chairing the UNGA as a president of the UNGA, even a little bit earlier, also foreign minister for Serbia. And you told me that you at least have 3 close experiences with multilateralism. The one of course, being the fact that you were president of the UN General Assembly, but also that you had the application of Serbia to the European Union starting under your leadership and Boris' Tadić's leadership. And then also that you headed a meeting of the non-aligned states some time ago. But the same question for you from the experience at the helm of the General Assembly. What are the kind of solutions you would put forward to refurbish UN, please?
Well, thank you very much, Yves. And at the onset, I'd like to say how profoundly grateful I am to Nizami Ganjawi Foundation for giving me an opportunity to visit Azerbaijan again, the country for which I have very, very special feelings, having started the diplomatic relations between our countries as foreign minister at a time when both of our countries had severe menace to our territorial integrity and sovereignty. So this was a friendship forged in difficult times. But times were very different back then. And times were very different even a few years ago when I actually ran for the post of Secretary General and ended up in the final as the runner-up. This was a moment when there were a lot of people running for the office, and a lot of people were proposing how to change the United Nations under different circumstances. And what do I mean by different circumstances? There were always quarrels, and they were difficult developments at that time as well. There was a Syrian war, there was a Libyan war, and so on and so forth. But even under such circumstances, multilateralism produced results like the SDGs, like the Arms Trade Treaty. I presided over the General Assembly when this breakthrough treaty was signed. Even climate change, there were big advancements that were made. But something changed between then and now. And I'm not going to get into details of what changed because we could spend hours discussing. But unlike then, now we live in a time of a geopolitical recession. Now, when one says recession, one usually thinks of economics. But the geopolitics is similar in a sense that the developments are cyclical. So in economy, there are periods of booms followed by periods of bust. And they tend to last for a few years. So in geopolitics too, there are periods of booms. This is when the multilateral institutions are created, when cooperation flourish, where the breakthroughs are being made. And then they're followed by periods of busts, periods of recession. Unfortunately, in geopolitics, they tend to last much longer. They don't tend to last for years, they tend to last for decades. So we are, I am afraid, in one such situation. So one has to be very realistic when one discusses what can be achieved under such circumstances. I think it is very difficult to see the set of developments that would lead us away from getting deeper in what is essentially a Cold War between East and West, the Cold War of our times. It's perhaps most obviously manifested in case of the war in Ukraine, but I'm talking about the deeper developments. And I'm afraid that I'm not terribly optimistic whether this strategic shift can be changed very quickly. Under such circumstances, one has to think, if you're a small country, and majority of countries that are members of the General Assembly, that are nation states of the UN, they are small, they're not terribly powerful, as the layout of bloc division emerges in front of their eyes, they can either join one of the blocs, or they can try and think how to pursue their interests that are exclusively theirs and not somebody else's. In other words, how to be non-aligned in the modern sense of its meaning. So the revitalization of the non-aligned movement that was achieved under the leadership of Azerbaijan, and I want to commend Azerbaijan for doing that. For many, many years, the non-aligned movement was meandering and wondering as to how to come out of the identity crisis that was brought about by the end of the original Cold War. Well, this new meaning through the post-COVID engagement and anti-vaccine nationalism, this is something that I really think is very commendable. But the question is, what now? If the non-alignment is something that looks like an attractive option for the majority of world countries, at least those who do not want to pick a side, the question is, what is going to be the purpose? As Mr. Hajiev rightfully asked, what's going to be the purpose of the non-aligned 2.0, if you will? And I think of no better topic, to be very realistic and perhaps not so diplomatic, as a matter of fact, than the war, the ongoing tragedy, the war that is felt by everybody, and this is the war in Ukraine. I know that I might say something that is not a universal opinion, perhaps not even terribly popular, but I'm going to say it nevertheless. First of all, I have no sympathy for Russia's invasion. I come from a country that, as a matter of fact, was a subject to an aggression. This aggression was committed not by Russia, but by the West. As a result of this aggression, we had a serious violation of our territorial integrity. Something similar, again, by Russia happened to Georgia after it happened to Serbia. So I have no sympathy for any such movement. But I heard in the panel of today a definition by one of the participants that the only way to achieve peace is for Ukraine to win and for Russia to be defeated. I'm sure that the Russians view this in the opposite way. But the way the majority of the world, and especially the developing world, sees this, is that they want this conflict to come to an end as soon as possible. Because it is everybody who is suffering, and suffering very profoundly and significantly as a result of this conflict. The food prices, the energy availability, the energy prices, the shifting away of the attention from the fulfilling of the Sustainable Development Goals to winning a physical war in the north, These are the things that are profoundly pressing the world's developing nations. So if I were to lead a country that is a member of the non-aligned movement, today I would propose that I knew that I was going to say something controversial, but I was not expecting such a
It was my
big
way
reaction
to point
to
at
that.
the elapsing time.
Anyway, to cut the very long story short, what I would propose as a non-aligned initiative, and non-aligned are the majority and therefore the conscience of mankind in a way, is for this war to be brought to an immediate end and for a political and diplomatic solution to be sought in the interest of humanity, in the interest of the developing countries, just as in the interest of the developed countries, as soon as possible. Right now, believe it or not, it is not very popular to call for peace, not even in the United Nations. I find it bizarre. Something is profoundly wrong with an organization that was built in order to maintain world peace if it's not proper, if it's not kosher, if you will, to call for immediate peace. And I think this is what NAM could do, should consider doing, and that would give it a very, very prominent reason of existence and propulsion of its significance in the world, the difficult world of today.
Thank you very much. As mentioned before, I would like to invite now two colleagues that are living in a country that was subject to war, to domestic issues of violence, and that have been to a certain extent also subject to interference by multilateral organizations, be it with success or not. And so, ladies first, I would like to invite Nino Burianadze, who has been president of Georgia, twice acting president of Georgia and Speaker of the Parliament, to give us a little bit of a sense of how you see strengths and weaknesses of multilateral cooperation, and maybe if you could shed a light a little bit on the experience of Georgia in its interaction with multilateral approaches to peacemaking, peacekeeping, and the position of your country, situation in your country. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a great pleasure and honor to participate in this panel and to be here in Baku. I'm very proud that my country, Georgia, and Azerbaijan have very close cooperation before independence and especially after independence of our countries. And it's very important for both of us, for Georgians and Azerbaijan people, to have this very close cooperation, and it's very important for the region and for the regional stability. We faced with lots of problems, and I will speak, of course, from the side of Georgian perspective. And we are speaking right now about United Nations, we are speaking about multilateralism. Yes, we all understand right now that we faced with lots of and very serious crises, and the situation is very dangerous, not only for the region, but for the whole world. And we need effective mechanisms to first, right now, to find some solution. And we need the right mechanisms which will help us to avoid in the future to have the situation which we have right now. But how and where we can find these mechanisms? Of course, we all remember the history of creation of United Nations and lots of hopes concerning UN activity. And of course, United Nations did a lot in many directions. But right now we see, and even I can say from the perspectives of, remind myself, 2008, tragic events in Georgia, that unfortunately United Nations is not effective enough to prevent conflicts like we have in 2008, like we have in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine in 2014, right? We have right now after invasion of Russia in Ukraine. And of course, it's very difficult to speak about effective mechanisms from the side of United Nations when from one side we have Security Council and members of Security Council who have right of veto. And sometimes we face that, okay, 3 or 4 UN permanent members of Permanent Council, they are paralyzing the work of United Nations. Yes, we are speaking about changes in the status of UN, but we don't have this kind of mechanisms. And how can we just achieve the situation when United Nations and Security Council will be effective? Even Secretary General Mr. Guterres criticized efforts and results of working of Security Council. How can we achieve any realistic results when, for example, 3 permanent Security Council members out of 5 quite often fighting with each other? Yes, the discussions concerning the changing of veto right, it's of course have a ground, but from another side, we all know that never any members of permanent member of Security Council will agree on this kind of changes when they will lose the right to use the veto. We are speaking here about General Assembly, and of course General Assembly is a very important body of United Nations, and this is unique when every country, big countries and smaller countries, have one vote and they are equal. But we know lots of examples when resolutions of United Nations General Assembly, okay, they were perfect, but they were not working. And I can bring example of concerning Georgia and conflicts in Abkhazia and so-called South Ossetia. We are really happy that we have lots of resolutions of the General Assembly which support territorial integrity and sovereignty of Georgia, which is calling Russia to withdraw Russian military bases or to just give a possibility to refugees to come back on their own homeland, but okay, it's unfortunately not working. It doesn't mean that we have to cross United Nations role in today's world, because United Nations is still really effective in many, many directions, but we need to think about how to change the recent mechanisms or how to add new mechanisms which will help United Nations and civilized world to make our world more secure and more stable. And here, multilateralism, I think, is very important direction. And I think that we have to use force and mechanisms of cooperation inside of regional organizations. This is a very important issue. And I think that in regional organizations, smaller countries, countries who know their own problems very well and who are cooperating quite seriously among each other, in regional organizations might be more helpful if we will add efforts of regional organizations to the efforts of universal organizations like United Nations. We all want to change the recent development. We all want to solve the problems which we faced with. But solution is that we have to strengthen regional organization and to use them in multilateral cooperation. I think this is very important. And if we will improve existing system, which will better just address specific regional changes. In this case, I think that this organization could play a critical role in promoting multilateral cooperation. Of course, I don't have any recipe which we can all use to make our world more secure and better, but combination of UN Security Council, UN General Assembly with existing regional organizations or maybe new ones, I think will be more positive result, because to destroy right now United Nations, despite of the fact that we don't like, I don't want to say don't like, we are not satisfied with the results of working of United Nations. To destroy this organization will not bring any kind of positive results. This will be not a right step. But to use the United Nations as a platform for multilateralism and to add to United Nations as the mechanisms and institutions, I think will bring results, and to involve in this direction smaller countries, countries which want to play their own role in international relations, and they have right to play their role in international organization. Countries who want to defend themselves, their own legitimate interests, to involve these countries more, I think will be more effective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. President Ivanic, Mladen, maybe you can testify also as the former head of state of a government, of a country that was more or less even created or stabilized via, amongst others, multilateral cooperation. Maybe you can, with a bit of insight, tell us what your view is on strengths and weaknesses of multilateral action and how we should strengthen multilateralism today and for the future. Please.
Thank you. It's also my pleasure to be today here and to say a few words and to be in this forum, which is, I think, a very good achievement of NGIC. These days, when the war in Ukraine started, it always remembered me on the first year of Bosnian war. At that time, I was among the Serb side, and nobody wanted to speak about the peace. Everybody wanted to speak just about the war and to killing other side and to winning other side. That take all of us who are trying to speak a little bit about the peace, we seem like a little bit crazy, not a part of the society, that we are almost treaters of the other side. If you see what is going on these days regarding Ukraine, I have the same feeling like at the beginning of the war in Bosnia. 4 years after, 100 people killed, which is 3% of the population of Bosnia. People are becoming of the war, and everybody started to speak about the peace. So we needed 4 years, 3% of the population killed. I don't want to speak about displaced persons, about the refugees, not at all, even bigger number. To apply that in Ukraine and Russia, it would mean about at least 6 million people killed before starting to speak about the peace. So generally, I really believe that we have slowly to think not only about the big basic values, but about the consequences of these values on the people on the ground. It's easy to stick to the basic values and not to think that the final outcome of that will be a lot of dead people on the ground. So 4 years after, in Bosnia, both sides were tired of the war and ready for the negotiations. Then negotiation was there, and the solution was basically that there was no winner. All sides had something, but didn't have everything. And both sides are a little bit happy with the solution, but also unhappy. And that's the only trick why the solution is still sustainable and working. It's far from being idealistic. It's not. We are even more complicated than the Belgium, if I may say so. But it's working, because there is no winner. If you have a winner, loser will always try to find the second half of the game to be in position then to win. And this is a never-ending story. And we had something which is not possible these days in the situation in Ukraine. There was agreement about the big powers. They were all supported the same solution. And only that is the reason why Bosnia is not the perfect, but stable country. In that sense, I'm a little bit pessimistic about these circumstances currently in Ukraine, and knowing all these big wordings, politicians speaking about the big values. And what would be the final outcome? I'm a little bit worried. And because of that, I'm coming now to this non-alignment story. This world, the modern world, is faced with so many conflicts very close to us, not only Russia and the West. West and the China. It looks that it will something happen relatively soon. What then? Then we have some sort of the very cautious approach of the other two big countries. You know, India, Brazil, they are all trying to find their space here, and I don't see that they are very happy with all these developments. So the world is faced with the new conflicts. And because of that, I think that we need some sort of the new alignment movement, something. It cannot be the old one because of a lot of reasons. I was old 3 years when the non-alignment movement was established. I was educated in that sense in former Yugoslavia. Like a young child, I remember Nehru, Nasser, Tito, Sirimavo Bardanaike, all these old guys who were seen like leaders of that part of the world. We don't have it now. But there is a need there is a need for the third voice, which will be between the extreme positions. At some point, I thought, but I'm a little bit disappointed at that there is one strong institution which can lead that new movement, which is the European Union, because European Union, by definition, is multilateral institution. It's institution based on the compromise, on the consensus, on the equal rights of all members. But somehow it looks to me that now even the EU is losing that potential leading position in that part of the world. So my intervention is just to open us not to follow just a mainstream of the thoughts which are every day in the media. And if you have a little bit different approach, you are also socially unacceptable person. That is not good. We have to have free way of thinking and in the best direction, trying to achieve something which is positive for the people. So lessons learned in Bosnia is, at the end of the day, after so many killings, after so many destructions, there was a peace, solution was in between, there was no winner, and thanks to that, it's sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mladen. In fact, Mr. President, in the second part of your excellent intervention, you bridged kind of to the next two interventions. I would like to invite the two members of the panel that have held recently important positions in the European Union to intervene, starting from the fact, and you pointed at that fact, Mladen, that European integration can be seen undoubtedly, besides of course the UN system, as a very important dividend of peace. After the Second World War, step by step, integrating basic infrastructure, economy, and then step by step over the internal market, trying to explore even more deeper political cooperation, even ideas about strengthening defense capacity. Over all kinds of crises, step by step, but still it is there. It is blamed for lots of things we heard in other panels, but still it is there. One country left. I'm not convinced that it's extremely happy with its current position. Anyway, Prime Minister Muscat and Jan Kubis, I think you're sitting there somewhere. I can't see you from here. Yeah, hi. You're very tall, but I couldn't see you. But maybe I can ask both of you and Prime Minister Muscat to give a little bit of a view on strengths and weaknesses of multilateral cooperation seen from your point of view, and also maybe a take on this non-aligned countries movement, the role it could play in strengthening again the multilateral cooperation. Please, Prime Minister.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Actually, I think that the intervention that we just heard was fantastic, and I would like to latch to that. I believe that there are two key words in here. One is crisis, the other one is leadership. I believe that strong leadership acts to avert crisis, while weak leadership is made to act by crisis. Right now, we have no leadership. And thus, the only option for change is through a crisis. And I think that it's pretty evident looking at history within a more philosophical context that if we don't, step up to provide leadership, and when I say we, I use the term very loosely. It is, 5 key players in the world that need to show that leadership. Unless they do, it will be a crisis that will resolve the current impasse. Which leads me to my second point. My country, Malta, is the smallest member state of the European Union. We used to be part of the non-aligned movement. We had to leave because we joined the European Union. I do remember from my childhood the non-aligned movement being some sort of staple news point. If you ask me whether there is a future for it, I would say yes, but if it's repositions itself in a way that it does not sound like a spectator, but rather as a player. Because at least the old non-aligned movement would say, it's a choice between 2 blocks and we're not taking sides. I would say the new non-aligned movement needs to be the 3rd block, rather than, the spectator leaving the others to battle it out amongst themselves and then, say, hey, I sided with no one, I'm supporting you both. So that's my second point. My 3rd point is that within the global context, we are seeing very, very rapidly the shifting from the politics of persuasion to the politics of coercion. And this is obvious in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, even though that's not the only situation. But it's also present in other ways. So, contrary to popular belief, I don't think that the biggest weapon that the United States has is the nuclear weapon. I think the biggest weapon is the US dollar. And really and truly, in many cases, many smaller countries, less economically stable countries, are made to toe certain lines and not to rock the boat because they want to remain part of the global financial system, which leads me to why I think Azerbaijan is doing a good job, because it's financially stable, independent, an energy supplier, and it can speak its own mind. Probably, if it wasn't so, it wouldn't be able to provide the leadership that it provides right now. So hooray for stable countries who can speak their own mind. And this leads me to my final point, because I know we're very pressed for time. I am extremely optimistic on the project of the European Union, this warts and all. For the simple reason, I was a member of the European Council for 8 years. I attended, I believe, more than 60 European Council meetings, because there were quite a number at the time, coming from the Greek crisis to the migration crisis, so on and so forth. I recall only once us taking a vote. In all other cases, we would sit down, and despite the fact that at any point in time, anyone could ask for a vote, and it would be, pretty obvious, where there is a veto, there is a veto, where there isn't a veto, there is a qualified majority. You know where you stand. It's very easy. It was only once that we took a vote, and actually we were all sorry for taking that vote, because it left a lot of acrimony. So what's the difference between the European Union and the other experiments. I would say that it is not simply a political project, it's an economic project. It's a project that's not based on yesteryear. It started off as the United Nations as a result of I wouldn't say as a result of the war. I would say that the United Nations started as a result of the war. I would say that the European Union started as a result of the peace. And maybe fundamentally and philosophically, that is why it is more successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to add that I testify indeed that there are only very rarely votes at the European Council. I would only bring the nuance that, and colleagues in the room will correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression was that sometimes big shots can also use some pressure, not to have to come to a vote, but the result is sometimes the same, to be squeezed as a middle of small country, and so on and so on. Anyway, Jan Kubiš, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Slovakia and also Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission of Europe, another country of the member state of the European Union, your take of what has been said until now and how to fix the issues of multilateral cooperation, please.
Thank you very much, and I would add that I worked for many years for the United Nations as well, so I have that sort of experience, and I would like to add some elements on this. But starting with the European Union, you know, why I believe that's a successful project. It's, yes, economy. It's not how to only prevent wars, but how to build peace, how to reinforce cooperation. But it starts with common objectives and shared values and relatively strict peer review. If peers are not delivering, European Union is able to tell them and then to take measures to encourage gently or less gently to deliver according to the shared values that must be there. This is something what unfortunately I'm afraid we see vanishing from the more broader world, including from the United Nations, including from more complex European, all-European cooperation, because truly what happened now with the Russian aggression basically destroyed the whole, not only architecture of European cooperation and security. Let's not forget, it was not only about security, it was about cooperation. All the modalities, it's almost destroyed, I don't know. I was once also the OSCE Secretary General. I don't see now the OSCE. It's very difficult to function. It's not only about a consensus principle, it's about shared values, shared objectives, and strict peer review. That's why I am also a believer of the project of the European Union that is ever evolving, ever deepening. I believe that we are reasonably successful, not to proud ourselves of ourselves, reasonably successful internally. Externally, I believe it's a mixed bag. We have a lot of ambitions, we have a lot of declarations, but we do not deliver always. Now, for example, again, coming to the sad situation around Ukraine, we mobilized ourselves. Why? Because it's in our backyard. Why we are doing something now what we, frankly, very often failed to do before. That was mentioned also yesterday during the opening night owl session. In a way, double standards, if you wish. Why we are mobilizing ourselves now to an extent that is relatively effective and right, and why we are not able to do a similar, to cope with similar situations, maybe not that grave, but in a similar way, if it's happening somewhere else. So from my perspective, this is one of the lessons that we need to learn as the European Union. If we would like to be a global player, as we declare ourselves, and we have this aspiration and vocation to be, we have to step up to our own principles and norms, and then help deliver results all around the world. For the United Nations, I agree with Madame Burjanadze, this is not the time, in spite of all the paralysis and problems, to write off the United Nations. It would be then free for all. It would be power of might and force instead of power of law and principles. And again, while the UN Security Council is often paralyzed, still they can deliver, and they deliver in many aspects. They give mandates. The General Assembly is something that I cherish more and more, I have to say, because I believe that the General Assembly can give at least moral and political mandate and show the right direction. And then we have partnership, and it was mentioned here, with different regional organizations. It's good to reinforce their hand, not that they cannot act. They very often act without any support or without any need from a mandate from this global body. But with a mandate, even from a sort of moral political mandate from the General Assembly, it's easier, it's better. And then practical partnership, where including the Secretary General is building and can be building stronger partnership with regional organizations using instruments that the Secretary General has. A proactive policy, engagement, taking risks as necessary. I have a lot of UN colleagues around. I'm not saying that the UN is perfect, it's far from it, but the potential is there. And it was mentioned as well, a huge array of humanitarian agencies, specialized agencies. That's the unity of objective, unity of purpose, based on certain principles. So what is needed for the UN is to refresh itself, to revamp itself. I'm not going into the issue of the Security Council. That has been tried, and yes, it needs to be addressed, but there are ways and means how to do the job more effectively using the current institutions, the current instruments, notably when working with other partners all around the world, regional organizations notably. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan. I would now like to turn to someone who's close to the engine of the most important, the biggest multilateral organization in the world, the UN, close to the engine, the cockpit in Geneva, be it not in New York, but in Geneva. We have, with NGIC, built up recently quite a close cooperation with the UN in Geneva. And David Cikvaidze, who's the Chief of Staff, Chef de Cabinet of the Director General in Geneva, maybe you could react to what has been said and at least testify based on your experience handling some of the ways to maneuver the organization through stormy weathers and try to improve the functioning of the UN, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's getting late. Thank you for giving me the floor. I will try to respond to your question by addressing terminology and periodicity. But I'd like to predicate all that by saying that I will be basing myself, as you suggested, on my experience at the UN, but I'm not speaking as a designated UN official. The last thing you want to hear is official positions. But I can give myself a little bit of leeway as I'm close to retirement after 30 years. So if somebody doesn't like what I say, they'll have a harder time firing me, and it'll take longer to fire me than for me to retire. And the terminology, I'd like to start off with multilateralism. In the UN context, in the international context, words have a tendency to quickly become mantras. When we talk about multilateralism, I would suggest that we need to distinguish two aspects. One is the multilateralism as embodied in the organizational aspect, in the structures, in the settings, of which the United Nations is the most universal. The other definition of multilateralism is the mindset. And very often when we say, oh, we need to improve multilateralism, we have to come up with a new multilateralism. Is the new multilateralism born? Is it dead? If we think about it, we're talking about the structures, and we're saying, well, the UN needs to adapt, the UN needs to... What needs to change, in my view, is the mindset. Multilateralism has come a long way, from the Westphalia treaties to the Congress of Vienna to the Paris conference in the early 20th century, to the San Francisco conference, to Helsinki, to the Paris Charter for a New Europe, et cetera, to 2015 and the Paris Accords. And most of these happened because there was a mindset to do it. But here's the kicker. The mindset came about in most of these situations historically after a cataclysm. And it was the cataclysm, whether it was the 100-Year War or the First World War or the Second World War, that made people think, governments think, that we need to sit down and talk finally. So our biggest problem today is we cannot let a cataclysm occur in order to develop the mindset for multilateralism, because if a cataclysm occurs now, it may be our last cataclysm. And in determining this mindset, I would suggest that the mindset be directed at in two directions. Towards multilateralism, how to implement the mindset of multilateralism and work, tinker, let's say, and reform the existing structures. And the second one, a very special second direction, which is we have to get back the mindset of arms control, which is totally forgotten, thrown by the wayside. But again, we have to do it without a new Cuban Missile Crisis or some other crisis. And this has to happen. By the way, as a sort of throwaway phrase, when we talk about climate change, we talk about climate catastrophe, most of the time we chase 4x4 vehicles and so on. I have not heard yet any serious discussion about the damage that wars do to the climate, that maneuvers do to climates. When we start talking about inventing an electric tank, then I will say that we're on our way to finding a solution. Or electric fighter aircraft that burn 7 tons of fuel per minute. That is the biggest problem here. Now, very quickly to turn to the aspect of multilateralism towards the practicality. And here, the term would be the expression, the age of the UN. We keep saying the UN is 75, 77. It is moving on to 77. And very often we say that it is the 77-year-old that we're dealing with. I offer that we are not dealing with a 77-year-old, we're dealing with a 32-year-old. The UN that came about after the end of the bipolar world. Because a lot of things changed. And I would say that the biggest disservice to multilateralism happened in the middle of the 1990s, which was denying Secretary General Boutros Ghali a second term. That gave a very clear signal to the world and to all the future Secretaries General that the UN does not have this very, very clear, strong role. Now, the end of the bipolar world, another catchphrase that has become, because we all start from there. What I would like to suggest is that what happened in 1991-92 was not the end of something. It was the beginning. It was the first step in the transition. It took 30 years of wandering in the wilderness without knowing where we want to go, How do we create a system that would satisfy most countries to wind up today, which in my view is the second stage, and it is a crucial stage. Now, the third stage will be once we define and answer the question, what happens after the end of the war in Ukraine? How do we live? What structures do we create? Are we going to lock ourselves in a big stockade or in 2, 3 stockades? Or do we, can we come up with something that is livable for everybody? Unless we do that, we won't be able to do any good. And very lastly, let me drop a bombshell. I have intention to write about this. I think we need to reform the Security Council, and I think we are looking in the wrong direction by adding permanent members with veto power. There are 2 things that I would suggest. I'm sure it'll be received as dead on arrival, non-starter, what have you, but I would make the G20 plus the AU, African Union, the permanent members, and add 14 members for a total of 35 to be non-permanent members. And here's the punchline: get rid of the veto. Impossibility, maybe, but humankind has managed to get the impossible done. If we do that, we will see a totally different UN, which will be much more attentive to diplomacy, negotiation, horse trading, because right now you have 5 people who are going with a gun in their pocket to a knife fight. And that has, perhaps it had a reason to exist for the first couple of decades, but like tonsils in a human being, they have served their purpose, and they are now only creating negative effects. So those tonsils need to be out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, including for the provocative ideas at the end. Last but not least, I will give the floor to Antonio Zanardi Landi, but announcing that I will, if there is any demand for reactions or question, I think we have time for 2 or 3. But before coming to that point, I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Zanardi Landi, who has a very interesting career as a diplomat, having been posted in Moscow, for instance, also having been diplomatic advisor to the President of the Italian Republic, founding nation of the European Union, and also founding member of the UN, of course. And you also have some experience in big corporates, in multinational companies. So I think you're very well positioned to give a kind of, well, some concluding remarks after having heard about non-alignment, about being in the chair of the UN General Assembly, of being leading countries that were subject to multilateral cooperation, over European integration, to the cockpit in Geneva. So the floor is yours. Some general impressions.
Thank you very much, Yves. It's really quite worrying to have to draw conclusions after having heard the 75th and the 77th President of the General Assembly of the United Nations and all the others who have been telling something incredibly interesting, in my opinion, confirming me in my conviction that it's always worthwhile to come to the Nizami Ganjavi things and to come to Baku, because I'm coming back, a few days ago from the Munich Security Conference, which is an incredibly interesting exercise, overcrowded with ministers and presidents and prime ministers. But there, the message was a little bit too homogeneous. The message was Russians were not there. There was just one Chinese, Wang He, no Indians, no Algerians, no Egyptians, for what I've been able to notice. And the idea was, we have to help Ukraine to win the war. We have to be close to Ukraine, which is totally understandable and totally positive. But what struck me is the complete absence of any idea of sitting around the table and talk, even without a solution, but just to imagine a framework for the talks, just to imagine hypotheses A, B, C, G, etc., etc. On the contrary, the message was totally homogeneous. Today, on the contrary, we have heard very diversified opinion and very interesting one. For the first time in months and months, I've heard mentioning the movement, the non-aligned movement, the non-aligned movement, which has been a part of our youth. We have been studying, working with the NUM. Now you don't hear so much to talk about the non-aligned movement, and you can hear perhaps more frequent references to the global south, which is a completely different subject, even though members are very often overlapping. But Vuk Jeremic explained to us probably the reason why we are talking and listening so little about the non-aligned movement. The fact is that there is no clear objective. There is no ideological glue. There is no common purpose. Today, the Global South is an enormous group of countries which are suffering, which do not recognize themselves in the Ukrainian war. And one for all, Jai Shankar, the Indian Prime Minister, doesn't let 1 week elapse without saying, it's not our war. You haven't been talking about us when China was pushing us on the Himalaya. You haven't been talking about us when Pakistan was doing something. You are not talking about what is happening in Africa. I mean, we have 600,000 casualties in Tigray just a few months ago, and nobody has been talking or reading about that. So there is no common purpose, but there is a big group of countries representing a very important part of the world. What Ismahan has told us and what President Horta Romas told us it was very telling. It's useless to elaborate more than that because they have been very clear and very useful. Just to draw your attention on the fact that many ministers for foreign affairs in Europe have told us that the last vote at the United Nations was a big success. But in my opinion, it was not a big success at all, because the resolution of the Assembly asking Russia to withdraw and condemning the Russian invasion got 141 votes, which was exactly the results of 1 year ago on the vote of the 2nd of March. 7 countries instead of 5, 2 abstainees less, but more people who had chosen that very moment to go to the toilet. So the number of abstention and absentees was enormous, and they were representing 56.4% of the global population. Probably not the most active, present, well-informed, but nonetheless is quite impressive number. It doesn't take away one straw to the validity of the decisions of the General Assembly, which remains important, valid, and pregnant. But it has to persuade us that we have to start thinking also about persons who are, countries who are not voting or who are going to the toilet at the moment of the vote. But it was quite a consistent number. 13 people disappeared at the moment of the vote. So let me comment what Minister Kubi said. Europe as global player. I'm a great fan of Europe. I have 2 daughters, and I christened them Caterina Europa and Benedetta Europa, which means that I do believe in Europe and the future of Europe, and I've been working all my life for the success of the operation. But as Europe, as a global player, I do not have any trust any longer. The Ukraine has been the last big coup to the idea of Europe as a global player, because Europe has been, well, NATO has been growing enormously and regaining a purpose. Time is up. Europe is concentrated in helping Ukraine, which is good, which is a showing of unity, and is fantastic. But apart from that, all the rest has disappeared. I don't want to sadden you naming the dozen of examples which are showing to us that the thing is going on a complete different direction. I think that time is up. We could go on talking for another 5 or 6 hours between us and with you, but I thank you very much for your attention, and I thank very much Yves for the wonderful way of managing this panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. As promised, on the one hand, we will have indeed opportunities in the coming hours, dinner and others, to discuss amongst ourselves. But on the other hand, I think it's time, maybe for the first time today, to give at least the opportunity to a couple of colleagues in the room to raise their voices and give their views on what we have been discussing. I see one hand here. With the light, I don't see very well in the back of the room, but, well, let's start here on the first. Yes, please. Is there a microphone? And if yes, could it be handed over to the lady, the first row, please? Yeah. Is there someone who, or should I? Yeah. Just a little moment. Yes, there is a microphone, and it's close to the person that wants to speak. Please, here. No, here. Yeah, there.
Oh, I may end up with 2 microphones. Thank you. I'm Aminata Touré from Senegal, former Prime Minister of Senegal. I wish, really, we have mixed this afternoon panel to this morning panel. It would have been a very nice combo. Because I do believe, I'm a pacifist, and I do believe that we gotta come to ending the war first and foremost. Coming from Africa, we know what aggression means. It's almost in our DNA. You know, starting far from slavery, colonization, neo-colonization, I can go on, and still struggling. But we learn that we need peace. We need peace to prosper. We need peace to develop. We need peace to produce. We need peace to be in our own well-being. So the group of African countries in the General Assembly was kind of a little bit bullied by some countries for abstaining. But maybe we need to explain also the history a little bit. Some of our countries had to go through liberation war to get rid of colonizer and very brutal colonization. That's when we talk about brutality, we can write theses and theses about it. But some of those countries had the help of other countries. Russia, not to name it. So you can explain, you can understand why a country like South Africa would abstain, for instance. Well, when they were struggling during the apartheid time, there was one sole help coming from Russia. We are not into, of course, everybody wants this war to end. When we see the pictures on TV, we see women, we see children, we see old people being killed, etc. But that needs to stop
Even
immediately.
Even men are killed.
And men are killed, the soldiers to begin with, most of the time. So if we can be, as I would not say outsider, because we stand by human rights, I work for the UN for many, many years, we stand for peace. What this world is lacking is to revivify the movement of pacifism. I think that is very important that we do that, but for the time being, all effort must be put in place to start negotiation, to have a ceasefire, and to go back to the negotiation table. I think it's very important. I mean, I felt like I had to say this, and I wish, as I said, that the message of this morning would have been mixed by the wisdom of this morning, of this afternoon, and then Africa and other parts of the world would come together and support, you know, the recovering of peace in that part of the world, because the consequences, we talked about it. But definitely, I do believe also that the United Nations need to be further supported. That's the only place where we have an equal voice. It doesn't happen in any other place. So I do believe also that the United Nations need to gear up to its historical role. And I think there is a lot of things to be said, but I think it's about time that we all support the United Nations, and whoever want to step in. I think Africa can have a role, because we can talk to both parties, but the most important thing is to come quickly to the end of this war, to have a ceasefire as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another intervention?
Thank you, Yves. Just a quick question. I think today, I mean, thank you very much for your ideas around multilateralism, your support, but also many of you gave a solution, particularly around the Security Council. So from abolition to taking off the veto, how can we do it? So could you give us a way to go forward and change the Security Council, or to abolish it? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Somebody else? A last one? There in the back of the room, well, two. One in the back of the room and then in the front. And then we stop, because there should be things left over for discussion tomorrow. So
That's right. Thank you very much. I'm Frank O'Donnell. I spent 32 years working for the United Nations, and I'm still sort of hovering around in the corridors of conferences like this. I want to thank the panel very much for what you've said. It was extremely important also this morning to hear President Aliyev, our host, basically telling us how important Azerbaijan has been working to revive the non-aligned movement. And Vuk Yermich has sketched out very well, I think, the importance that it can play in the future in terms of hopefully bringing peace to Ukraine sooner rather than later. But I wanted to mention, firstly, that the UN Charter, most people are probably not aware of it, has not been revised since 1971. And I think it's long, long overdue. The mere growth of the UN to 193 member states today from the original 40 or 50, 1945, should itself have prompted a reconsideration of the structures for global governance. So that's the one thing. And when it comes to the veto, interestingly enough, there is in the UN Charter, Article 27, paragraph 3, which essentially says under certain circumstances, a party to a conflict cannot exercise the veto. We could reinterpret it more creatively than we have done. Now, the General Assembly, of course, in the absence of action by the Security Council for a year, has passed no less than 6 resolutions. And if Kerry Kennedy gets her way, there may be a 7th, which actually goes towards an international tribunal. But I would also like to mention that, unfortunately, because of the war, but even before the war, the Sustainable Development Goals are in dire straits right now. And the Human Development Index, for the first time in over 30 years, has dropped in the past 2 years to the level of 2016. And that was before the war started. I fear that by 2025, we will have lost 25 years, and the HDI will be gone back to perhaps the year 2000. So something desperately needs to be done, and desperately quickly. Now, we talked a lot about multilateralism. I would like to just mention a word I'd like to coin, which is money-lateralism. And in fact, there was talk earlier by Jose Ramos Hortos, President of East Timor, about the importance of the finances that will help the poor countries, the LDCs, overcome the current predicaments that they face with energy and poverty. Now, the IMF in August 2021 released 620 billion in a new special drawing rights mechanism. But unfortunately, the experience has been that most of that money has gone to the industrialized developed countries. And there have been calls for a new tranche, which the United States, as Treasury Secretary Yellen, has opposed. And I think we need to rethink that. Maybe America could help rethink that and make the SDR situation much more equitable for the world. Now, we're in the Anthropocene. My last comment is simply to say we should be at the Epistocene, the era of knowledge rather than just human influence, and we need to get to the Sophicene, which would be the era of wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you. Last intervention here in the front. Yes, please, quickly. And then we have maybe a reply on the question how to start a discussion on Security Council and so on, and then we close. Please.
Thank you very much. I made a promise to myself when I came not to speak at this conference, because I've been speaking.
Human nature.
And yeah, because I'm tired of speaking. For 40, 50 years I've been talking. I'm a Libyan. I come from Libya, and I come from the Arab world. I live in Lebanon.
Can you hold the microphone a little bit closer? Yeah.
Did you get it that I'm a Libyan? Yes, yes. What I have to say, and many of you have got used to me to say the truth and nothing but the truth. I have been working, walking, dealing with the United Nations, many different agencies in the development field at the beginning, and then in the whole issue of the mess that we are going through in Libya. It is not denying what contributions maybe they have been trying to do, but to be honest with you, the United Nations has been a big failure in Libya, big time, to the point that I have to tell you, and maybe I have to say this, the appointment of the last government has been, the Prime Minister reached his position with bribery, paying some representative in the dialogue committee that has been formed by the UN. So, the UN, we had 11 representatives from the United Nations to solve the Libyan problem. And many of you can follow up the mess that has been created in Libya. Total failure. What angers me, everybody, every country, Arab, non-Arab, American, French, Italian, the French and the Italians started the mess to solve our problem, okay? They were fighting who should jump in. Now everybody has jumped in. And we ended up with militias, with terrorism, with two governments, with two parliaments, with billionaires who have stolen the money of the Libyan people, and Libya is very rich. A big chaos. So when we speak up, it is not that we have to say, oh, yes, we need the UN. Well, yes, the UN is doing good things. But we have really, we need also to discuss how to prevent the corruption within the UN system. The corruption is everywhere. Then they talk transparency, no transparency. The European Union, I happen to be the Libyan representative in the European Union. I don't know how it happened to me, by mistake. I resigned because I found myself going into one room, to the security room, to the immigrant room, to the blah, 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 blah. Everybody is really not saying the truth. If this world, if this mess, if this hate, the hate is escalating everywhere. Okay, yes, we are very sad for what's happening in Ukraine and with the Russian, but are we talking about what's happening in Palestine? Nobody mentioned Palestine, and many of you are following up what's happening lately and what has been happening. Resolution after resolution, tons of resolution is telling me, oh, I have to look at you. Okay. So, piles of resolution, lack of total transparency. Even when I was at the EU, I resigned. Every representative will come to me, say, Farida, oh, I agree with you. But to be honest with you, they never talk publicly about what they're thinking about. There is fear, there is special interest, there is hypocrisy, there is no democracy, there is confusion, there is lack of courage, there is domination of money, money, money. They talk about our region and our politicians as being corrupt. Look at the corruption in Europe. Look at the corruption in the United States. Corruption is everywhere. Is everywhere. And for me, this is the cancer of where we are. So
okay.
I have to thank you for giving me the floor. And excuse me because I'm not feeling well. I have so much medication. I don't even know. Excuse me if I'm not. My mind is not organized enough. But I wouldn't go to bed tonight without getting this out of my system. I already have the flu.
Thank you. Just 1 or 2 minutes reaction to the demand. I think it was a question raised by Isma about how to start a process of changing composition of Security Council and so on. The good ideas, but how do you start a process? Mr. Hajiyev?
Just very quickly, thank you for the question, Madam, how we start and from where we start for the United Nations Security Council. You know, Azerbaijan in 2012 and 2013 was a non-permanent member of the United Security Council. And our internal assessment, we came to this conclusion and deriving one lesson from the Soviet past. When you become member of the Communist Party, the first question you ask, do I have a right to speak? The answer was that yes. Can I speak? No. And therefore, being a non-permanent member, United Security Council, we understood that as being a non-permanent member, you don't have a right to speak. And 5 members are coming together, discussing everything, and making a decision on your behalf. But also, along with the change of the geographical representation and composition of the Security Council, methodology must be changed as well. But your specific question from where we start. It's almost 20 years, there is one panel about the reform of the United Nations Security Council and discussing the same issue. When it comes to the 5 members and they're making a decision over and again, we are in the vicious cycle. Therefore, the problem is about the 5 permanent members. Let's be objective. They don't want to release their right and their monopoly over the status. And one of the easiest solutions could be, of course, through the General Assembly, majority vote. From there, we can identify the issues with regards to reform of the Security Council. But why is a crucial reform of the Security Council? I also carefully listened to the distinguished panel. At the global level, let's be having a better diagnostics of the current situation. The key component, key problem that we have about the peace and security. That's also preamble of the United Nations Charter. And Security Council, first of all, is responsible for peace and security. If you don't have any peace and security, you can't talk about the development. Everything starts on peace and development. And also, we have criticized a little bit the United Nations system and so on. Of course, United Nations system has its own share of the criticism, but UN is also about the member nations. And member nations should also respond to the questions, are we honoring all our commitments in a full manner? So that UN can also fulfill its obligations. And it also, again, the biggest question, first of all, goes to biggest countries and also permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. And last but not least, about the non-aligned movement. Again, the colleagues raised questions about cornerstone principles or commonality of vision within the non-aligned movement. Of course, non-aligned movement cannot be a solution to all problems that we are facing currently. And also, we are, Azerbaijan, as a chair of the non-aligned movement, understanding all of its challenges and also understanding the fragmentation within the United Nations family and also seeing East-West confrontation. We couldn't just stay idle and wait for the East-West confrontation will be better and we'll join to the mainstream. So we said that, okay, what kind of instruments that we have, let's redesign or adapt this instrument to the current realities. And a fundamental shift that we have made, Non-aligned movement sometimes meant that, one of the colleagues, former Prime Minister Muscat was right, that it was just a spectator sort of an approach, just waiting and seeing what's going to happen. Therefore, we changed this concept. Non-alignment movement doesn't mean a neutrality for us. And it shouldn't be you stand just idle and to see follow the process of what's going to happen. But we decided that within our family, not just waiting for the end of the East-West confrontation to find certain solutions to our certain problems. But last comment, and sorry for being long, about the double standards. Double standards is the key as well. And here, I believe the international community everybody has its own responsibility. And my country, we have witnessed double standard for many years. UN Security Council resolutions. 4 years, we were asking for pleading the international community about honoring demands of the UN Security Council resolutions. Now, I'm a little bit surprised. Entire Europe, and as on the table in OSCE, where Azerbaijan is a full member, everybody talks about the sacrosanct principle of territorial integrity. But what about Azerbaijan's territorial integrity? For 30 years, we were pleading to everybody. There was no reaction. In the context of Ukrainian conflict, old Europe wake up and understood that there is such a problem of territorial integrity. But what is the problem for Azerbaijan's territorial integrity for 30 years? Again, with the double standards and selective approach to the cornerstone principles, unfortunately cause a lot of injustices in our international system, but fundamental issue at global order. We should also think about what will be and shape of the new global order. Here, and of course, Security Council reform is a key. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you. Someone else? But then we stop. The last word to the talker, yeah.
We must be realistic. Because I have mentioned the Constitutional Court example, we can't get rid of the Security Council. We don't have the luxury to be without the United Nations. But in politics, sometimes one day is too long and 5 years is too short. From our European Union membership process, one of a talented commissioners said, if the political atmosphere is correct, you will become member in 2 days, 2 months. If there is no political climate, then they will say the color of your tomatoes is not red enough, and you will be prolonged for years and years. So the United Nations Security Council reform is the same thing. We must wait for an opportunity. Today it's not possible, but we must be ready when time comes. Makes it possible, and perhaps start with the geographical distribution. There are countries in the Eastern group which belongs to the European Union. Cyprus is in the Asia group. Many countries are in the East group. Turkey is in the West group. Some countries don't know where they are. Russia doesn't know where they are. So I think we can start with practical things, preparing first the structures, which is from the 20th century, to be prepared for the 21st century problems.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists, and thanks to the audience for your continued attention. Thank you very much. Bye. Thank you.